Okay, welcome everyone. Today we have a very special presentation. There's still a few more weeks that we can plant our heat-loving vegetables in gardens in Tucson. So our squash, basil, okra, sweet potatoes. But for a lot of different reasons, you might miss that planting window, or you might have a gap in your garden because a bunny ate everything. Or you may have a gardener join late in the season and not know what to plant because it's too scorching hot to get vegetables established. So there's myself and Brandon Merchant wanted to share a few different ideas for things you can plant during the heat of the summer, specifically cover crops and pollinator plants that can be a little bit lower maintenance, just to give you some new ideas to try. So go ahead and go to the next one, Brandon. Okay, welcome everyone. So my name is Melissa Munt. I am the Community Engagement Manager with Community Gardens of Tucson. Hello, I think you guys mostly know me, but I am so happy that Brandon Merchant can be with us today. Brandon and I worked together for like, I don't know, 10 years, something crazy like that. And he's run his own business, Southwest Victory Gardens. He's now working with the Community Food Bank, doing all sorts of amazing work in the demonstration garden there and with school gardens. And I'll let Brandon, do you want to share anything else about yourself or where you're coming from?
Nope, that's good. I think that's good.
Okay,
Thank
cool.
you.
And we also want to just hear who's in the room. So throw into the chat, how would you describe gardening in Tucson in the summer? How would you describe Tucson summer gardening? Let's be real. Let's be real, folks. Okay, I'm seeing last summer was a killer, prickly, brutal, dead. Ooh, ouch. Time to plant and leave town. Lots of tomatoes. Thank you for that positive note. Yeah, very good. So gardening in the summer, we always start off the spring with like really high hopes. It's dark at 4 in the morning. Yeah, you got to get up early or stay up late to get your gardening in. I feel like in the spring, we start off with high hopes, and then it is going to get brutally hot in approximately a month. That's perfect, Brandon. You can stay there. So this class is designed for if you already have a garden, if you're gardening with Community Gardens of Tucson, but by chance any of you aren't or know someone that needs a garden plot, my email's right there. We got everything to get you started, so give me a call or an email. Go ahead and go to the next one, Brandon. And today we're really gonna focus on cover crops and summer gardening. So we're gonna learn what are cover crops and how they can be a beneficial tool in our garden. We'll understand why low water use cover crops are a better option than leaving an active bed fallow for the summer. And we can dissect that a little bit. And then we'll be ready to try some new ideas and actually enjoy summer gardening and not dread it. The couple of extra things I wanted to say about an active bed. If there is a garden plot that no one is using and no one is likely to use, I think the best thing to do is mulch it and turn off the water if there's no plans for it to be used. But if there's an active bed that someone is going to take soon, or that there's just a gap and someone wants to plant soon, this is the situations when we're talking about wanting to keep that soil life alive by doing some cover crops instead of just letting it bake in the summer. So hope that makes sense. And I think now I'm handing over to Brandon to dig into what are cover crops.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was a great intro. Yeah, so I got several keyboards in front of me, so I got to find the right one here. So yeah, let's talk a little bit. Let's get first, before we get into the importance of cover crops and pollinating plants, we just want to really briefly touch on our seasons here in the desert. So a lot of folks that are gardening here have perhaps gardened in other places where, gardening's a little bit easier and there's more predictable, 4-season gardening schedule. But here in the desert, we have, a very unique climate, and so we have to sort of adapt to that. And so, what what I want to show you sort of the differences of the different ways people might decide to plant their garden. So one way some folks do it is a very simple 2-season planting schedule. This is something you might see in a lot of places, not just in a desert garden, but oftentimes in the spring you're planting, long growing crops or things that are going to take a longer season to grow, or also things that can tolerate the cooler weather. And then in the fall you're going to be planting some of those more leafy greens and other things that are tolerant to much colder weather. So this is a very typical type of planting you would see in a lot of places. So here, for example, you might do your spring planting in March and your fall planting in September, and then just sort of, get everything planted all at once. But a lot of folks like to break their seasons up. And so this is a simple sort of 4-season planting schedule. You can kind of see here that, in the fall and later in the fall, we're planting our leafy greens and our root crops. And in the spring, we're growing lots of fruiting crops. So things, like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants and stuff like that. But we also have the very hot part of the year, we call late summer monsoon, and also that very, very cold part of the year in late winter and early spring, where we can actually continue to plant things. So this is more of an adapted schedule to our climate. And so another way to look at it, is to just sort of, pop it onto, one of the many planting guides that are around. There's I think Community Gardens has a planting guide. I know Native Seed Search has a planting guide. This is the Tucson Organic Gardeners planting guide. And you could see here, we're sort of in this period of late spring between the mid April and the end of May. And, you can kind of see as we get into the hottest parts of the year into June and into the monsoon, it gets pretty limited as far as what we can plant. So because it's more limited in this really hot part of the year, we want to try and grow those plants that are most adapted to this really extreme dryness and extreme heat. So that's going to be a mix of very heat tolerant crops. So things again like different types of pole beans like cowpea, melons and sweet potatoes and okra. Those can all tolerate a lot of heat. But also, as we get closer into the rainy season, we can start to plant a lot of our native crops as well. So things like tepary bean and our native squashes and native beans and corn can all go in around that time. So this is sort of the period of the year that we're sort of talking. So what we're hoping to do is plant things that can really tolerate the heat, right? The dryness and the heat, but also maybe add a second benefit. So in the case of cover crops, we'll be adding crops to sort of build up the soil, or in the case of pollinator attracting crops, those are going to be crops that can attract pollinators for us. And you might even be able to find something that does both, a cover crop that also helps to attract pollinators. So, all right, what are cover crops and why are they important? So there's a definition here I pulled from Wikipedia that's a little more extensive, but basically a cover crop is anything that you plant for the intention of rebuilding the soil. So there's different types of cover crops. Some of them build up the soil by adding nitrogen fixation to the soil. You can see in this chart here, there's nutrients floating around in the soil. You have some N, some nitrogen, and some P, some phosphorus. Some plants like legumes and beans actually help us with fixing nitrogen into the soil. So that's one way that cover crops help us. Another way is that they grow a lot of what we call biomass. So all that leafy green stuff you see above the ground, all of that can be reincorporated into the soil and chopped down, broken up, and then reintroduced into the soil to basically reincorporate nutrients from the soil. So you take a plant that's growing above the soil, you chop it up, and you work it back into the soil, and all of those nutrients are returned back into the soil. So it's a great way of recycling nutrients, and it's a very it's a type of gardening that's very replicable of nature. So in nature, you often see plants grow and then die back, and that's sort of how the cycle works, and they feed themselves. It's also a replicate of many traditional indigenous gardening styles. So like the milpa, which is a corn garden. The corn is often harvested and then the plant is chopped in place. So it's a very traditional method of gardening, as well as being a very productive method of gardening as well. All right, so why is that important? I always like to step back a little bit sometimes when we're talking about soils, because it's important to understand that a lot of the things that we do to our soils that we think of as normal, things like rototilling, or the applications of synthetic pesticides and things like that, we do those things often without questioning like why. And a lot of times, those methods of quote unquote traditional agriculture can be very destructive to our soils, and to the microbiology and the health of our soils. So here's just a few facts that I've pulled off the internet. I pulled these from The Guardian. So you can see over the last 40 years, about 1/3 of the farmland around the world has been degraded to a point where it's no longer farmable. And so, we're rapidly depleting much of the world's most fertile soils. And as a result, we get reduced yields. We require more synthetic fertilizers and more synthetic pesticides to grow the same amount of food on the same amount of land. So as we continue to practice things like plowing or excessive tillage, we continue to degrade the soil. So one of the things cover crops did is, before modern agriculture, farmers would sort of alternate their crops from season to season. You would plant a very nutrient dense crop or a crop, excuse me, that required a lot of nutrients, like say wheat, for example. Wheat would pull a lot of nutrients out of the soil. So then the farmer in the following season would plant something like a peas that would reincorporate those nutrients back into the soil. And that again was a very traditional way of agriculture. But with the advent of synthetic fertilizers and things like that, farmers are no longer it's no longer necessary for farmers to do that, because they can just pump their soils full of all sorts of chemicals. And when we do that, we really affect what's called the soil food web. So this little chart here sort of shows how all of the critters that exist in the soil, like the things that we can see, like earthworms and beetles and stuff like that, interact with some of the microbiology that we can't see in the soil. So things like bacteria and fungi. But all of that basically works together with plants to sort of create a healthy ecosystem underneath the soil. And when we mess up this ecosystem, it can affect our plants in some negative ways. So the benefit that we're going to talk about today is, when we keep these plants in the soil, we keep organic matter in the soil in the form of roots, and all of these microorganisms that exist within the soil can sort of continue doing their normal functions in the soil, like creating nutrients and breaking down organic matter. Okay, so in my soil workshops, I usually teach a few methods for folks to improve their soils. We talk a lot about compost, obviously, compost teas and things like that. But many of the things that we talk about in a soil building class, we're actually going to discuss today. So namely the elimination of broad spectrum pesticides and fertilizers, as that relates to pollinator gardens specifically, but then also incorporating this no-till or low-till gardening methods with cover cropping. So when we do these things together, we get an increased benefit of the soil. So we'll talk a little bit about the use of mulches, the benefits of cover crops, and also why eliminating pesticides will help us with our pollinator gardens, all of which is going to help us to work to improve the soil. So real briefly, we'll touch on mulches. Because a cover crop is essentially what we would call a living mulch. A mulch is anything that's going to cover the soil. So anything you put on top of the soil, whether it's a piece of cardboard or wood chips or compost, is technically what we would call a mulch. Now, when we grow plants very close together and very densely, and they grow up and they work to shade out the soil, that is also a mulch. We call that a living mulch or a green mulch. And so when we incorporate cover cropping, we're actually incorporating a form of mulch as well. So, but you can see here that, anytime that it's possible for you to cover the soil, it's going to be very important that you do that. It's going to help to keep moisture in the soil, which is obviously very important in a desert garden. But it also helps to keep the microbiology in the soil alive. It helps to shade the soil from direct sun, which can also damage the soil in some ways. So if you have plants around your property and they shed leaves, just go ahead and leave those on the ground. Seed pods, everything that you can, just kind of leave there. And when it comes to your garden beds, I think alfalfa hay makes, sorry about that. I think alfalfa hay makes an excellent mulch for vegetable garden beds. It's very nutrient dense and full of nitrogen. And if I'm going to be using mulch around my property or around trees, fruit trees, I'm probably going to use something like wood chips for that, or maybe possibly straw. Okay, so the idea with the cover crops and why they are so effective at building both soil microbiology and building up the health of the soil is because it's basically a way to compost in place, so to speak. So instead of at the end of the season, a lot of times what might happen is you can grab a plant by the roots or by the base of the plant and pull up the roots and put that into the compost pile. And then, oftentimes you'll add compost, back to the garden bed and till it over. And then that's sort of how a new garden bed is usually prepped. With this cover crop method, you can actually more effectively do that process by sort of eliminating the step where you take the plants out of the soil and compost them separately. You can effectively just compost right in place in the garden bed. So some crops, especially grasses, allow you to continually throughout the season go through and chop them down, and just like you would be sort of like mowing the lawn, so to speak. You can take a hedge trimmer or garden scissors and just chop those plants down multiple times throughout the season, and all of that green material would fall down onto the soil surface and you would just leave it there. Another way to do it is just to, again, allow your plants to grow till they're fully mature. And then at the end of the season, again, you would use like a hedge trimmer or some garden scissors or whatever you have to chop those plants down, leave all the material in place, and then you would plant directly into that material in the next season. It's also important during this process that you leave the roots in the soil, because the roots work sort of to incorporate organic matter underneath the surface of the soil without having to dig it in. So cover crops basically work as a way of fixing organic matter and nitrogen and other nutrients back into the soil without having to compost them separately. Okay. There's some really cool bacteria in the soil. I won't get into this too much, but legumes make particularly good cover crops because they're actually able to, through this symbiotic process with these bacteria that you can see sort of on these roots here, and these little bumps we call nodules. Those are actually beneficial bacteria incorporating nitrogen into the soil. So before I move on to the pollinators, were there any questions? Let's see, we have a few in the chat. Mesquite leaves and beans be used directly in the veggie garden as mulch. I love mesquite leaves. I think they're an excellent mulch, especially if you have mesquite trees around the property. They break down really nicely and they're quite abundant. Pods as well, I use those frequently, but you do have to be mindful that if any of them sprout, you got to keep up on the weeds. So let's see here, quite a few questions. Should you wait till the mulch if the plants are up? I do. If you can, you can wait till they sprout and then mulch. But if you want to do things easily, you can just put the mulch down like right after you plant the seeds. But I often tend to wait because in one of my gardens specifically, I have a problem with cutworms. And if I put the mulch down first, then I get some of the cutworms chopping my plants down. And let's see, alfalfa bales often break off in sheets. Would you break those up? Yeah, just break it up as fine as possible. You can even go to the feed store and sweep up some of the loose straw, or excuse me, the loose hay around the bales and buy it like separately. Oops, I don't know why my screen's going backwards. And let's see, why not hay? Some of our gardens seem to like that. I actually do recommend hay. I don't recommend straw for the garden. So straw is a byproduct that's from after grain is usually harvested. And so you have a lot of issues with weeds if you're using straw. You have lots of grasses and things. Hay, on the other hand, alfalfa hay is harvested before it goes to seed or even before it goes to flower. And then so it doesn't, alfalfa hay it's green, it's full of nitrogen and nutrients, and it doesn't have weed seeds in it. So that's why I prefer alfalfa hay over using straw. All right, so
one more or a couple more just came in, Brandon.
oh, okay, sorry.
What about the weed roots of like Bermuda grass, crabgrass, dandelions? Yeah, take those out.
Yeah, you got to take out your weeds, and the longer the more you garden, you'll sort to understand which weeds can sort of be chopped and the roots left in the soil, because a few can be, but others you need to just completely remove entirely. And so I would start by making sure just removing all weeds until you know like which ones are sort of a little less invasive and more okay to leave roots in the soil. For now, just take everything out.
And then cutworms. Want to say more about cutworms? What are cutworms?
Yeah, cutworms are just tiny little worms that live in the soil, on the surface of the soil. They look sort of like little gray caterpillars, and they like to eat plants as soon as they pop up out of the ground. And so they hide under the mulch. And so if you put the mulch down before your seeds pop up, sometimes the cutworms can come after them. But it just depends on your situation, your garden. I in my home garden, I don't have the cutworm issue. And so I'll plant the seeds, put the mulch on top, and then the seeds will just poke right through. Awesome. All right. So now moving on to the short section here on pollinators. And then we'll go into some of the specific types of plants that you might be able to incorporate some of these methods. So there's a cool video at the end of the presentation I think y'all should check out about pollinators here in the desert. But just a few little things that and there's also some great resources on as far as like building pollinator habitat, and it's all specific to the Southwest and to the Sonora Desert. So I encourage you to check all that out as well. So we all know pollinators are very important as gardeners because we're trying to grow food, and if we want our plants to produce, especially things like squash, we absolutely need pollinators around to help us with that. So there are just thousands and thousands of plants that require pollination in order to reproduce. So in Arizona, it's sort of a unique issue because we are basically like the pollinator capital of the world. Roughly, I think 7% of the world's pollinators, bees, are native to the Sonoran Desert in Arizona. I think it's like 20% of the bees in North America, or maybe even closer to 30%. So we have like just that, you know, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of types of bees here. All of them require sort of different habitat requirements, but they all have one thing in common, and that's that they all pollinate plants. So of course we have other pollinators like bats and butterflies, but bees are the primary pollinator, and there's just a ton of them. So we want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to help them out, because a couple of them are not doing so well. So now I guess I'm going to hand it over to Melissa, and she's going to let us in on some of the cool plants that we can use to attract these pollinators and to work as cover crops.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Yeah, now that Brandon kind of set up the importance of, oh, do you want me to share now, Brandon? Sort of the importance of cover crops and pollinator plants. Let's zoom into what can do really well in our hot summer. So this is just a overview of what we're going to look into briefly. Cowpeas or black-eyed peas, pole beans, or tepary beans aren't exactly a pole bean, but they're similar. There's different kinds of grasses, Cespania, amaranth, zinnia, and a handful of others that do great, like buckwheat, sunflower, saffron, cosmos, and marigold. So again, just to reiterate, cover crops and pollinator plants are things we're growing not necessarily for human harvest, for human benefit, but rather to benefit our microorganism friends, our pollinator friends, all the creatures that are going to keep our gardens thriving. And they're a great thing to plant in gaps in your garden where you don't have other vegetables going. Also, many of them are very tall, so they can help to shade and work as companions for your other vegetable plants. So let's zoom into these a little bit. Oh, go to the next one, please, Brandon. I don't have control, that's right. Okay, so cowpeas are an excellent cover crop. If I know I'm not going to garden in my bed for the summer, I'll just plant cowpeas everywhere and turn the irrigation way down, and they just do their thing. They're a legume. They fix nitrogen in the soil. They also are great for seed saving. You can eat all of the beans when they harvest, or you can save them for next year's planting. But they are super heat tolerant and just gorgeous. This is a picture of them growing up the side of my chicken coop, which really helped keep that cool. I saw a question come into the chat that you shouldn't plant beans next to marigolds. I haven't had that experience personally. Sometimes I feel like that really black and white companion planting advice should be taken with a grain of salt, because there is so many different microclimates and different growing conditions. And I would just say try it and observe the results, but I've definitely planted beans and marigolds together and they don't seem to mind. But go ahead and go to the next one. So tepary beans are kind of amazing. They are a heritage crop. These have been grown for thousands and thousands and thousands of years here in our Tucson basin. And they are adapted to monsoon agriculture. So they're sort of flood irrigated at first to get them started. But then the less water they have, the more beans they produce. And I often see these fail in home gardens or community gardens because we're trying to water them so much. So if you have a little corner of your garden that is not getting a lot of water and you get these established, they can be a really wonderful cover crop because they're fixing nitrogen, but also really delicious and a great way to connect with the agricultural heritage of this region. Onward. So grasses are really fun to try. So grasses are, they're monocots. They're a different in the dicots, monocots, where the plant form diverges. They just have one little sprout that comes up first. So like corn is also in that family. But these are unique because they have incredibly fibrous root systems. So in terms of what Brandon was saying about composting in place, like putting the biomass into your soil, you can't do better than these grasses like millet and sorghum. They're also heritage crops. They've been part of human agricultural history for millennia. And if you have chickens or like birds, millet and sorghum are the main ingredients of bird food. And so if you do let it go to seed, that can be really beneficial for those critters. Kathy asked how much water in the hot summer for beans. We'll get into watering in a little bit because I think there's a little bit of nuance there, but thank you. Okay, I want to spend a little bit of time with Cespania because I find it so amazing. Give me for the few of you that I can see, give me a thumbs up or raise your hand if you've ever seen this plant or grown this plant. Oh, Carol has, great, cool. Jessica, awesome. So it was actually Brandon that introduced me to this crop. I'm not sure where he came up with it. You can comment on that, Brandon. But it is a legume. And it is super, super tall and it looks like this little tiny picture is a picture of its sprout. Terry Michael always talked about Cespania. Yeah, totally. Thank you, Jessica. So from great minds come this amazing gem for summer gardens in Tucson. It looks like a little mesquite tree that's sprouting, but it's not woody. It's actually a very fibrous, long stem that's been used for making nets and fibers. It's just gorgeous because it can provide filtered shade for the rest of your garden. I had beans growing up it, so it was like a trellising plant. It seeds abundantly, so it's easy to save seed from and share seed. So one caveat, watch out. It is considered invasive in wetland areas, like in Arkansas or in swampy areas. It will reseed readily and become overwhelming to other plants. But in our desert gardens, I've seen it reseed itself, but I consider that a great thing in the desert garden. And I haven't ever seen it get overwhelming. But if you're like moving to another part of the country or have a lot of water around, maybe think twice about this, but otherwise, I think it's a total gem. I saw some questions about where to get seeds. Brandon and I are teaming up to get packets of a bunch of these different cover crop seeds out to all of the gardens. If you're not a community gardener, maybe just email us afterwards and we can try to figure out how to get those to you, or you should just become a community gardener. Come on, really. But yes, these seeds are we can get some to you, and also you can probably buy them online. I think at the end in the resource section, we have some options for where to find seeds for these. But I highly recommend Cespania. I don't know, Brandon, do you want to add anything about Cespania before we move on from that?
One thing I'll add is that it works well as a chop and drop crop. So you can actually chop it down halfway through the season when it's like about 3 feet tall. Just chop it and it'll keep growing. It's also a native of the Sonoran Desert. So if we're talking about drought tolerance and the importance of native plants, it's a traditional plant that's been used. I think another name for it is Colorado River hemp, and so I know it grows along the rivers. So yeah, it's just an amazing plant. We got tons of seed for it down at the food bank as well. So if you need some, you could come down to the food bank and get some from us.
All right, I think I'm caught up on questions. So we'll, should Cespania be watered? So all of the, well, let's get to watering in a minute. We'll say words about watering for all of them. So amaranth, another incredible heritage crop. The young tender leaves are edible. It's a great summer green. And also the seeds are edible. They're popped and roasted all over Latin America for different foods. And also the seeds have been, of this particular one, this is Hopi Red Dye Amaranth, were used as a dye plant. So it's really, really a beautiful addition, super tall, can shade your other plants. Pollinators love it. It will reseed, which some would say is weedy, but I think it's great because it's less work for me. And it's interesting in historical agriculture of this basin of the Hohokam people, they would grow sunflowers and amaranth like it along the edges of these flood irrigated areas with the corn, squash, and beans. And the amaranth and the sunflowers with their really dense root systems would help hold those banks and prevent erosion for that system. So just really, really cool plant. I think that's that. Onward, what else do I have on this list? Oh, so I've said a few times that some of these could be considered weedy, and I just wanted to put that out there. So there are weeds that should always be taken out, like Bermuda grass, first and foremost. But a lot of other plants that are considered weedy are just reseeding themselves, which I think is great. And they can be pulled out and thinned out as needed. But this, does anyone know what this large picture is on the left-hand side? And I see Peggy. What you got, Peggy? Yes. They beat you to it, Peggy, in the chat. It's a Purslane or verdolagas. And it's actually one of the highest vegetable sources of omega-3 fatty acids. And it does really well, as Brandon mentioned, a living mulch on top of our soil. Super, super heat tolerant and just goes crazy, and you can harvest it for your salads. Incredibly great plant. Many of these cover crops you will plant by broadcasting and raking in. And then just to mention this picture here on the bottom, you may need to thin some of them out, but then it's delicious. Throw those baby amaranth leaves in your salad, and it's super beneficial. So what's up next here, Brandon? Okay, I think we're caught up on questions, so I'm going to hand it back to Brandon, except the watering one. We're definitely coming back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back and answer those watering questions towards the end. All right, so we covered some of the basics of the better, like, heat tolerant summer crops that like provide multiple functions. So, plants like amaranth, they work very well at attracting pollinators, but they have that double, added impact of also, having those fibrous root systems and creating lots of biomass, and they're also edible, so you get multiple functions basically out of the same plant. But there are other plants that you can most certainly grow in the garden to attract pollinators. At the end of the presentation, there's a link to a blog post that I did on like 12 of my favorite like native perennial plants. But as far as incorporating, pollinator attracting plants into the vegetable garden or as annuals, any of the anything that flowers basically, that you grow for a flower will work to attract pollinators. But some of the ones we mentioned so far, again, amaranth is a really good one. Buckwheat is one that was mentioned as well. That's really great at attracting pollinators. And if you're just starting a brand new garden, I think buckwheat's one of the best plants you could grow, because you can go from seed to germination to actually the plant having a flower in as little as like 3 weeks. So that plant just pops right out of the ground and it produces a flower almost immediately, and bees will start coming to it. So if you like want to get a garden started like today and you want pollinators like tomorrow, buckwheat would be a really awesome plant that you could grow and get that. But there's some other things that we can do, not just the plants that we grow in the garden, but there's some other sort of techniques, that will also help, that we'll just mention briefly as we're, just talking about how to incorporate these, these new plants into our gardens. So there's 3 things that you can do. The main thing is to, plant for pollinators anywhere that you can. Pop in, a pollinator attracting plant. Try to squeeze them in, and if you can, think about plants that flower at different times of the year. There are plants that start to flower in really early January and February. Those are really good plants to have around the vegetable garden, because at that time of the year, there's really not a lot of flowering plants. So things like broccoli or bok choy that start to bolt, or lettuce that starts to bolt, you might consider leaving those plants just to grow a little bit longer until more native plants start flowering. So planting, especially for pollinators, is the most important thing that you can do. And native plants around the perimeters of the gardens can also work really well, because those are, those plants can flower at all different times of the year, and they can, once established, survive on rainfall alone. So that's a really important thing if you have gardens. Like, for example, Blue Moon Community Garden has a large perimeter of pollinator attracting plants that are perennial and desert adapted and native. And so those are really great plants to have. So you can, watch for pollinators. So if anyone wants to sort of take a initiative in their own community gardens to establish a dedicated pollinator garden, there are several groups like the Pollinator Partnership or the Monarch Watch, which are like organizations that will help to track, the migration of pollinators like monarchs and things like that, or to do like tracking of pollinator populations. So those are really cool things as well that can help, because if we're keeping track of, the numbers of the pollinators and keeping an eye on them, that's going to help us understand like what's happening in our ecosystem. And then the last thing we can do is really reduce our impact on pollinators. So in my garden, or in the Nuestra Tierra garden here at the food bank, I'm very mindful of when I pull plants out. If I have a flowering plant, it's at the end of the season, and it's, I'm not intending to harvest it for food, I'll make sure to look around before I pull it out of the ground and make sure that there's other flowering plants. And if there's not, I might leave it for another week or two just until something else, because that's one thing I can do to reduce, my impact on pollinators. But other things, obviously, that you can do are, reducing, the use of pesticides, synthetic pesticides, or even broad spectrum organic pesticides, which, can also have effect on bees. So things like neem oil, or soaps, those broad spectrum pesticides, if you actually read the warning labels, some of them say do not to spray around bees. So even though it's an organic product, it's probably not something you just want to go spraying willy-nilly. So again, in the resource guide, I have a list of native plants that you can start with, but basically any native plant, whether it's native wildflowers, or native shrubs or native trees, all of those plants in some way or another tend to support different types of pollinators. But be mindful that you need some plants that you want to attract caterpillars to. And so again, a caterpillar can be seen as a destructive insect by some folks, so you got to balance, between the adult butterflies, which feed on nectar, and then the larval form of the butterfly, like the caterpillar, which feeds on leaves of plants. So, for example, the swallowtail butterfly, it tends to lay its eggs, and its larvae will feed on plants like dill and fennel and plants in the carrot family. So if you have those plants in your garden, and you want to attract butterflies, you might have to put up with just a little bit of caterpillar damage in order to have the pollinators later. You can also incorporate things like bee walls, and insect hotels, as they're sometimes called. There's a really great handout in the pollinator resource guide that's provided that has some really great details on how you can build these bee boxes, what size of holes that the bees prefer, how deep the holes should be. And so if you want to incorporate some of these, insect hotels and pollinator nest boxes, you can put this in the corner of the garden somewhere and use that as a way to attract native pollinators. And you could do the same for like bats. You can build a bat house, and other things like that. There's also things like bird baths, or water features, and mineral supplements and things like that can also work. And then again, the main thing, especially this relates to pollinators, but also with soil health, try and really reduce the number of or amounts of pesticides that you're using in your garden. When possible, use what are called species specific pesticides. So something like neem, for example, neem oil is a broad spectrum pesticide. It coats, all types of insects. It can have a negative effect on a lot of different things. Whereas something like no-low bait, which is for grasshoppers. If a spider eats no-low bait, or a bee eats no-low bait, or a ladybug eats no-low bait, nothing's going to happen to it. But if a grasshopper eats it, then the grasshopper is going to get sick, and it's going to, it's going to die and get a tummy ache or whatever. But it doesn't affect any of those other insects. So be very specific about, the pesticides that you're using, even organic pesticides, because they can often have a negative effect. And then as it relates to your home gardens and, other areas around the community garden spaces, you want to be very mindful of the plants that are growing out there, and avoid plants that require, tons of maintenance and high amounts of pesticides or water use, and then again, substitute those for native plants that are drought tolerant, or even non-native plants that do benefit, like some pollinators that are drought tolerant and non-invasive. So there's plants from dry areas of Africa, like aloe vera, for example. They make great hummingbird attracting plants, but they're not invasive, and they're not going to outcompete our native plants. So you can also use those types of plants as well. All right, so we'll get into now, again, those are just some of the other things that you can do in addition to planting flowers and planting, pollinator attracting plants in the garden. Just a few steps that you can take, and that'll hopefully work to keep those pollinator numbers in the garden higher. And so we'll move on into this next section, where we'll talk a little bit more about some of the how-tos of to get this cover crops and pollinator gardens started.
Do you want me to take this part, Brandon? Yeah, okay. Great, so really briefly, I know that we're running short on time and want to have a little bit of time for questions. To get this started, remove weeds, rake in your cover crop seed, make sure you mulch either right away or after the seeds have sprouted, depending on your particular conditions, to help keep that soil moisture in. After they start getting established, you might need to thin them a little bit. And then here's the question of watering. It's a little bit tricky because in a community garden setting, you're on a timer. But these cover crops generally take less water. And because the purpose of them is just to be a living mulch in our soil, and continue to have a little soil life, it doesn't matter that much if we get a harvest off them. So in my personal opinion, you could play around with turning down the valves on your individual garden plot. And so you'll be still watered on the same time, but it will be a lesser amount of water. So you could play with how the plants are looking. If you're able to get a nice deep water when they're established, and then turn it down as much as you can, then you'll get that water saving benefit as well with your cover crop, along with all the other benefits. Now, every community garden is different. Some have super sandy soil types. And so you're really going to have to just play with it. Oh yeah, Jessica says, or just turn off one line, since gardens have multiple lines. But I do think that these plants will take less water, and as much as possible, we should try to push them to take less water. And because we're not trying to get like 40 pounds of tomatoes off them, we're just trying to keep our soil alive in an area where we can't be actively gardening for whatever reason. And yeah, then go on vacation or stay, but know that there's very little maintenance for these cover crops. There's no disease issues, there's no harvesting, there's no trellising. Their purpose is to grow and feed the critters that that we love in our garden. So I think, yes, we will share this recording afterwards. And I think we're down to resources. So these are links that if you go to the PDF that I shared, you should be able to link through, or if you hang on, I can transfer the links into the chat so that you can have those handy. But is there other things that Brandon you want to add, or any questions as we wrap up here? I'll transfer these links to the chat just in case, so you'll have them, I think.
No, just for the watering questions, there's this great guide, Landscape Watering by the Numbers. I recommend that to everyone that's, learning about watering. And there's a really great chart in the back that gives you an idea of how often you should be watering your different plants. So I usually refer folks to that one for sure. But yeah, these are just really good resources, and they're all specific to the Sonoran Desert. So the plants that are recommended are all going to be native or native adapted. One thing that's not included in here that someone asked about was where to get Cespania seed. The only place I've been able to find it is recently is there's a place called Hancock Seed, but you have to buy like 25 pounds of it or something. Like you have to buy a bunch of it. I haven't been able to find small packages of it, but again, if you come to the food bank, we'll give you some. I have tons and tons of it. So if you want to come down and you need seed, we can get that for you.
Hey, Melissa and Brandon, I have a question. So talking about things that are safe to use in the gardens for pollinators, we've had, as you know, a hard time switching to organic gardens. So it would be nice if we had some kind of like signage or resource that is displayed in the garden that lets people know like what's safe to use. And I'm just wondering if there's a resource for that already, or if that's something that we need to create.
I guess that would depend on your, what, there are basic signs that say, no pesticide use. They have those in English and Spanish, but they don't distinguish between, like, say, organic pesticides and non-organic. And again, there's organic pesticides that are safer, and then there are organic pesticides that are, very, again, broad spectrum and should be applied very judiciously. So it's very difficult to, I don't know how you would indicate that on a signage. What might be more appropriate is to have just a list of approved products. And anything that's not on that list maybe is not allowed. I think that might be an alternative.
Thank you.
Well, I popped those resource links into the chat. So you now have the presentation PDF, which should have those links and these other resources. So earlier, Peggy, in the chat, I put a PDF of this whole presentation. And so it should be this last page of the presentation. I'll also email this out with the recording link after the fact. I think we're right at time, but I'm sure Brandon and I are happy to stick around if there's any other questions. But I hope that this gave you some new ideas for things to plant if you kind of have an empty spot and didn't want to leave it barren. These are fun things you can try that benefit, of course, the non-human creatures in our environment.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much. Winter cover crops. You're gonna have to come back to the winter cover crop. No, yeah, there's also a bunch of cover crops for the winter. And if you go to the link of the seed blends, there's one called the Soil Builder Mix. That's a winter blend. That's a great mix. I've used it for years, and it's got a bunch of different stuff in it that works really well for grows over the winter. Awesome. Thank you to everybody. How can you persuade gardeners to mulch? Maybe just provide it for them, so it's there. If you buy a bale of hay, maybe you can let people buy a flake for like $1 or something, so they don't have to go and buy a whole bale. They could just just buy one section of it and then use it on their garden. But maybe just having it around the garden for them to use it.
And I think, Bruce, well, I think most of the gardens do have alfalfa now. And I think, Bruce, the thing to do is just lead by example. And soon all the gardens that are doing the greatest with bumper crops of beautifulness, people will start to see, oh, what are they doing differently that I'm not? We can also share the recording of this presentation with gardeners, or work on other materials that are a little more digestible. But I mean, I absolutely agree with Brandon that it's a really important thing in our climate for our soil life and for water conservation. So we got to make it the norm, not the exception.
How thick should the mulch be? That's a good question. I tend to put not a very thick layer, about 1 or 2 inches seems to be good. I don't think you need to go any more than, say, 3 inches. Any more than that, then you can be like, because we don't get long, deep rains, you can actually keep rain from getting to the soil. So you kind of got to find that balance of so I think 2 inches is pretty good.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a beautiful day, and